There are places on Earth that feel as though they belong to another planet. Places where roads disappear beneath snow for most of the year. Places where entire seasons vanish into darkness. Places where nature still decides who stays and who leaves. Most people will never see these places. Most people will never experience a winter so long that it seems endless. And yet, beyond the northern forests, beyond the last major towns, beyond the final traces of familiar civilization, there are communities that continue to survive. Communities that wake every morning surrounded by ice. Communities that endure storms powerful enough to erase entire landscapes. Communities that have learned to live where logic says human life should be impossible. This is not the story of explorers passing through. This is not the story of scientists on temporary missions. This is the story of people who call the Arctic home. And somewhere ahead lies one of the last villages before the frozen wilderness consumes everything beyond it. A place standing between humanity and one of the harshest environments on Earth. A place that forces a question that grows larger with every kilometer north. How is it possible for humans to live here? The journey begins in the air. Below the aircraft stretches a landscape so vast that distance loses meaning. Rivers appear frozen in time. Mountains emerge from endless white plains. The horizon seems impossibly far away. From above, there is almost no sign of civilization. No highways, no sprawling cities, no endless suburbs. Only snow, ice, and silence. Hour after hour, the Arctic unfolds beneath the wings. The farther north the plane travels, the smaller humanity appears. Villages become isolated dots. Roads become rare. Eventually, even trees begin to disappear. The world becomes simpler and harsher. The Arctic has a way of making people feel small, not because it is empty, but because it is enormous. The scale is difficult to comprehend. Millions of square kilometers of frozen land and sea stretching across the top of the planet. A region so large that entire countries could disappear inside it. And hidden within this frozen world are people who somehow continue to survive. People whose daily lives challenge everything outsiders think they know about human endurance. But before we meet them, we must first understand the environment that shapes every aspect of life here. Because the Arctic is not simply cold. It is a world governed by extremes. In much of the world, nature changes gradually. Seasons arrive and depart with predictable rhythms. Temperatures rise. Temperatures fall. Life adapts. But the Arctic follows different rules. Winter arrives with astonishing force. Temperatures plunge far below freezing. The wind sharpens. The landscape hardens. Lakes become roads. Oceans become platforms. Entire ecosystems transform. What was once water becomes solid ground. What was once familiar becomes dangerous. The environment is constantly shifting between states. Nothing remains permanent. Not even the land beneath your feet. For centuries, people living here learned to read these changes with extraordinary precision. A subtle shift in snow, a crack forming across sea ice, an unusual wind direction. Small details that outsiders overlook can mean the difference between safety and disaster. Because in the Arctic, survival depends on understanding nature. Not conquering it, not controlling it, understanding it. And that lesson becomes more important with every step farther north. At first glance, the village seems fragile. A collection of colorful buildings standing alone against an endless sea of white. It looks almost temporary, as though a single winter storm could sweep it away. Yet appearances are deceiving. Many Arctic settlements have survived for generations. Some have endured conditions that would challenge entire cities. Their bright colors serve a purpose. When darkness dominates the landscape and visibility disappears in blowing snow, color becomes more than decoration. It becomes orientation, recognition, safety. Every building tells a story of adaptation. Every structure represents decades of experience. The homes are built differently. The storage systems are different. The way people move through the environment is different. Everything has evolved to answer a single question. How do you survive here? Because every design choice matters. The Arctic rewards preparation and punishes mistakes. But this village is only an introduction. Farther north, the challenges become even greater. Farther north, nature becomes even more unforgiving. Farther north, entire months pass without seeing the sun. And that is where our journey is headed next. For most people, the idea sounds impossible. Imagine waking up and finding darkness outside, then waking up the next day to the same darkness. Then another day, and another. Weeks pass. The sun never rises. Near the Arctic Circle, the normal rhythm of life begins to break down. Farther north, it disappears completely. Winter brings the polar night, one of the strangest natural phenomena on Earth. For months, sunlight remains hidden below the horizon. The world exists in shades of blue, black, and silver. Streetlights glow through drifting snow. Windows become islands of warmth. Stars dominate the sky. Time feels different. The mind begins searching for familiar patterns. Yet people continue living normal lives. Children attend school. Stores remain open. Families gather for meals. Life continues despite the darkness. In many ways, community becomes stronger. Neighbors spend more time together. Traditions become more important. The Arctic teaches a powerful lesson. When nature removes comfort, people create it themselves. But darkness is only part of the challenge, because something else arrives alongside it. Something far more dangerous. The cold. The cold here cannot be compared to an ordinary winter. It exists on an entirely different scale. At -40 degrees, exposed skin can freeze rapidly. Breathing feels different. Metal behaves differently. Machines struggle to operate. Even simple tasks become complicated. Every trip outdoors requires preparation. Every mistake carries consequences. The human body is constantly losing heat. The environment is constantly trying to take more. And yet life continues. People adapt through knowledge passed down across generations. Layers of clothing become survival systems. Movement becomes strategic. Daily routines evolve around the realities of extreme weather. To outsiders, the conditions seem unbearable. To residents, they are simply part of life. The Arctic does not ask whether you are comfortable. The Arctic asks whether you are prepared. And for those who are not, nature quickly provides a lesson. Yet even extreme cold is not the greatest challenge facing these communities. Because survival here is about much more than temperature. It is about isolation. Imagine living in a place where help cannot arrive quickly. Imagine knowing that weather alone can separate you from the rest of the world. In many Arctic communities, this is reality. Air travel is often essential. Seasonal ships bring supplies. Temporary ice roads connect settlements for only part of the year. Everything depends on conditions remaining favorable. But conditions rarely stay favorable for long. Storms arrive suddenly. Visibility disappears. Transportation stops. Entire communities can become isolated. For people accustomed to modern convenience, such circumstances seem unimaginable. But Arctic residents have always understood the importance of self-reliance. They stock supplies. They prepare for emergencies. They help one another. Because survival has never been an individual achievement. It is a community effort, a shared responsibility. And perhaps that is why these villages continue to exist. Not because they defeated nature, but because they learned how to cooperate with it. Still, isolation creates another challenge. One that has shaped Arctic history for centuries. Distance. A simple trip that might take 20 minutes elsewhere can become a major journey in the Arctic. Distances are enormous. Landscapes are unpredictable. Weather changes rapidly. Travel often requires specialized equipment and local knowledge. Snowmobiles cross frozen terrain. Boats navigate icy waters during brief summers. Aircraft connect communities separated by vast wilderness. Every journey carries uncertainty. Every route depends on conditions. For generations, Arctic people developed remarkable navigation skills. Long before satellite systems existed, travelers learned to read the environment itself. The shape of drifting snow, the direction of the wind, the position of distant landmarks. Nature became a map, an understanding that map meant survival. Today, modern technology assists these journeys. But the old knowledge remains valuable. Because technology can fail, weather can interfere, batteries can die, yet the land continues speaking to those who know how to listen. And in the Arctic, listening can save lives. Beyond the villages lies a coastline unlike almost any other on Earth. For much of the year, sea and land seem to merge together. Ice stretches outward across the ocean. Frozen surfaces connect places normally separated by water. The environment transforms into something unfamiliar, something constantly changing. At first glance, the ice appears solid, permanent, safe, but appearances can be deceptive. The Arctic Ocean is always moving. Currents shift beneath the frozen surface. Pressure builds. Cracks form. Entire sections drift. The landscape itself becomes unstable. Hunters and travelers crossing these areas must remain alert. A route considered safe one week may become dangerous the next. The environment never stops changing, and neither can the people who depend on it. That relationship between humans and ice is one of the defining stories of the Arctic, a partnership built on respect. Because here, overconfidence can be deadly. Yet despite the risks, generations continue venturing onto the frozen sea. Not for adventure, but for survival. From above, the crack appears small, a thin line stretching across a field of white. But on the ground, it can become an obstacle measured in meters, or even kilometers. Sea ice is alive in its own way, constantly shifting, constantly responding to forces invisible to the eye. The sound of moving ice can echo across vast distances. Groans, cracks, deep rumbling vibrations, as though the Arctic itself is speaking. For experienced residents, these sounds contain information, warnings, clues, signals. Knowledge accumulated through generations transforms uncertainty into understanding. Outsiders often see an empty landscape. Local people see details, patterns, messages, and those messages can mean everything. Because crossing sea ice safely requires more than courage. It requires experience. It requires patience. It requires respect. The Arctic rewards humility and punishes arrogance. That lesson has remained unchanged for thousands of years. Then there are moments when the Arctic reveals another side of itself. A side so beautiful it almost seems unreal. The sky begins to move. Green light emerges above the horizon. Waves of color ripple through the darkness. The northern lights appear. Ancient cultures created stories to explain them. Travelers cross continents hoping to witness them. Even today, they inspire awe. For a few moments, the harshness of the environment fades into the background. The frozen landscape glows beneath shifting curtains of light. Silence fills the air. Wonder replaces fear. Yet the beauty of the Arctic is inseparable from its danger. The same conditions that create breathtaking scenes can also create life-threatening situations. And perhaps that contrast explains why the region feels so extraordinary. It is both welcoming and hostile, beautiful and unforgiving, magnificent and dangerous. Few places on Earth contain so many contradictions. and we are only beginning to understand them. For children growing up here, the Arctic is not an exotic destination. It is simply home. The snow, the darkness, the cold, these are normal parts of life. Skills that seem remarkable to outsiders become ordinary childhood experiences. Young people learn how to dress for extreme weather, how to travel safely, how to recognize environmental hazards. Knowledge is passed from one generation to the next, not through textbooks alone, but through daily life, through observation, through experience. Because survival in the Arctic depends on understanding the environment from an early age. The lessons are practical, immediate, essential, and despite the challenges, there is joy here. Friendship, family, community, laughter echoes through places many people would consider impossible to inhabit. Life continues, not despite the Arctic, but alongside it. And that may be the most remarkable lesson of all. Humans are capable of adapting far beyond what most people imagine. But this adaptation did not happen overnight. It is the result of centuries of experience, centuries of resilience, centuries of learning. And the deeper we travel into the Arctic, the more extraordinary those stories become. Somewhere beyond the horizon lies an even more remote settlement, a place standing closer to the edge of the frozen world, a place where darkness lasts longer, where storms strike harder, where isolation becomes even more complete. Compared to what waits ahead, everything we have seen so far is merely the gateway. The Arctic is preparing to reveal its true character, a world shaped by ice, a world shaped by endurance, a world where every day begins with the same question: can humanity survive here? And against every expectation, the answer remains yes. But that answer comes at a cost. Because the farther north we travel, the more difficult life becomes. And ahead lies a village where survival itself feels like an act of defiance. A village standing at the edge of the known world. A village many consider the last before the Arctic truly begins. And its story is even more unbelievable than the landscape surrounding it. To reach it, we must continue north, into deeper darkness, into harsher weather, into a realm where nature still rules, and where humanity continues to endure against impossible odds. By most standards, this village should not exist. It stands at the very edge of the inhabited world, where the Arctic Ocean stretches endlessly toward the North Pole, and where the forces of nature still dominate daily life. From above, the settlement appears impossibly small. A handful of buildings, a scattering of lights, a thin line of humanity pressed against one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Beyond it lies a frozen wilderness so vast that entire nations could disappear within it. There are no cities ahead, no highways, no growing suburbs, only ice, only ocean, only the raw power of the Arctic. For newcomers, the first feeling is often disbelief. How could people live here? How could families build lives in a place where winter darkness lasts for months and temperatures routinely plunge far below freezing? Yet for the people who call this settlement home, the village is not a symbol of hardship. It is simply life. Children grow up here. Friendships are formed here. Families celebrate birthdays, weddings, and holidays here. Life unfolds much as it does elsewhere. Only the backdrop is different. The backdrop is one of the most extreme environments on Earth, and every aspect of life has been shaped by it. But the deeper we look, the more extraordinary this community becomes. Because surviving here requires far more than courage. It requires adaptation unlike anything most people have ever imagined. Winter dominates everything. The homes reveal that reality immediately. Every structure has been designed with survival in mind. Walls are thick. Insulation is critical. Entrances are carefully planned to prevent heat from escaping. Windows become barriers against a world determined to pull warmth away. A simple mistake in construction can become dangerous. A poorly insulated building means higher fuel consumption, greater risk, greater vulnerability. Over decades, generations learned exactly how to build for these conditions. Nothing is accidental. Every design choice reflects experience. Every improvement reflects lessons learned through harsh winters. Inside, homes become sanctuaries. Warmth fills rooms while storms rage outside. Families gather together. Meals are shared. Stories are told. The contrast is remarkable. Only a few centimeters separate comfort from danger. Only a thin wall separates life from one of the coldest environments on Earth. Perhaps that is what makes Arctic living so extraordinary. The environment never allows people to forget its presence. Nature remains close, always visible, always powerful, always reminding residents who truly controls this landscape. Yet even the strongest homes cannot eliminate every challenge, because eventually everyone must step outside. And that is when the Arctic begins testing them again. The village streets appear quiet. Snow drifts across frozen ground. The air glitters with tiny ice crystals. Every breath becomes visible. Every movement sends clouds of frost into the atmosphere. Even ordinary tasks require preparation. A short walk to a nearby building demands proper clothing. A trip beyond the settlement requires planning. The weather can change rapidly. Conditions that seem manageable one moment can become dangerous the next. People learn to respect that uncertainty. They watch the sky. They monitor the wind. They pay attention to details outsiders often ignore. Because the Arctic rarely announces its dangers loudly. Sometimes it whispers first. A slight temperature drop. An unusual cloud formation. A shift in wind direction. Small clues that experienced residents recognize immediately. These observations become habits. Survival skills woven into daily life. Skills that have been passed from one generation to the next. Because in places like this, knowledge is more valuable than almost anything else. Knowledge keeps people safe. Knowledge keeps communities functioning. Knowledge allows life to continue. And nowhere is that knowledge more important than when residents leave the village behind. Outside the settlement, the landscape becomes immense. Snowmobiles trace paths across frozen terrain. Tiny machines moving through an environment so vast it feels endless. The scale is difficult to describe. The horizon seems unreachable. Distances lose meaning. Travelers navigate across frozen rivers, coastal ice, and open tundra. Sometimes visibility is excellent. Sometimes storms erase everything. The land becomes a white void. Sky and ground merge together. Direction disappears. These are conditions capable of disorienting even experienced travelers. Yet journeys continue. People still move across this landscape. Because transportation here is not optional. It is essential. Supplies must be gathered. Families must visit one another. Hunters must travel. Work must continue. The Arctic demands movement. And movement demands trust. Trust in equipment. Trust in experience. Trust in knowledge accumulated over generations. Without that trust, travel becomes dangerous. With it, people continue crossing landscapes that outsiders would consider impossible. But even these journeys are not the most remarkable aspect of life here, because survival depends upon something even more fundamental: food. For thousands of years, Arctic communities survived through extraordinary understanding of their environment. Long before cargo ships and airplanes connected northern settlements, people depended upon the land and sea. That relationship remains important today. Hunting continues to play a significant role in many Arctic communities, not merely as a tradition, but as a practical connection to the environment. The Arctic does not offer easy resources. Food is harder to obtain here than in most places on Earth. Every successful hunt reflects skill, patience, experience. Knowledge. Hunters read weather conditions, observe animal behavior, understand ice patterns, track movements across enormous distances. Success is never guaranteed. Nature always has the final say. And yet generation after generation developed systems that allowed communities to survive. These skills transformed one of Earth's harshest regions into a home. The knowledge became culture. The culture became identity. And that identity remains deeply connected to the Arctic itself. Because surviving here has never been about fighting nature. It has always been about understanding it. Still, the environment contains dangers that no amount of experience can completely eliminate. One of those dangers walks silently across the ice. Few animals symbolize the Arctic more than the polar bear. Powerful, intelligent, perfectly adapted to the frozen world. To many people, polar bears represent beauty and wilderness. To Arctic residents, they also represent risk. These predators can appear unexpectedly, moving across sea ice, crossing coastal areas, approaching communities. In some regions, residents remain constantly aware of their presence. Lookouts monitor surroundings. Safety procedures become routine. Respect is essential. The Arctic belongs to wildlife as much as it belongs to people, perhaps even more. Encounters are rare but unforgettable. A reminder that humans are not always the dominant force here. There are places where nature still commands respect. Places where people remain guests within larger ecosystems. The Arctic is one of those places. And nowhere is that reality more obvious than during the long winter months. Because winter changes everything, including the rules of survival. The storm begins quietly. A distant wind. A faint curtain of snow. Then conditions deteriorate rapidly. Visibility shrinks. Landmarks vanish. The world disappears into white. Blizzards are among the Arctic's most feared natural events. Not because of dramatic destruction, but because they erase certainty. They remove orientation, direction, perspective. Even familiar terrain becomes confusing. Travel becomes dangerous. Movement becomes difficult. Decisions become critical. For generations, Arctic communities learned how to respond. People stay informed, monitor forecasts, prepare supplies, remain cautious. Because storms here are not inconveniences. They are serious events. Events capable of isolating entire settlements. Events capable of changing plans instantly. The Arctic rewards preparation long before danger arrives. And nowhere is preparation more important than during the darkest months of the year. Months when sunlight becomes a distant memory. Months when survival relies heavily on community. Inside warm buildings, another side of Arctic life emerges. The side outsiders rarely see. Families gather together. Meals bring people into shared spaces. Stories travel between generations. Laughter fills rooms while storms rage outside. Community becomes one of the most important survival tools available. Isolation exists, but so does connection. In many ways, the environment strengthens relationships. People depend on one another. Neighbors help neighbors. Experience is shared. Challenges become collective. The Arctic encourages cooperation. Because no individual succeeds entirely alone. Every community depends upon countless acts of support. Small actions repeated every day. Helping during storms. Sharing resources. Checking on neighbors. Offering assistance. These practices create resilience. Not only physical resilience. Emotional resilience. The kind that allows communities to endure through difficult seasons. And difficult seasons are never far away. Because beyond the village, the Arctic continues evolving, changing, testing everyone who lives within it. During parts of the year, frozen surfaces become transportation corridors. Ice roads emerge, temporary pathways crossing landscapes that would otherwise be inaccessible. For outsiders, the concept sounds unbelievable. Driving across frozen water, crossing lakes and rivers transformed into roads. Yet in many northern regions, these routes become essential. They connect communities, deliver supplies, support daily life. Their existence depends entirely on temperature. A warmer season can shorten access. A colder season can extend it. Everything depends on nature. Every year becomes a negotiation between human needs and environmental conditions. The roads are temporary, fragile, dependent upon forces beyond human control, and perhaps that makes them symbolic of Arctic life itself. Everything here requires adaptation. Everything requires flexibility. Nothing remains predictable forever, not even the landscape, especially not the landscape. When summer eventually arrives, another transformation begins. Sea ice retreats, waterways reopen, ships return, communities reconnect with distant supply networks. The Arctic changes dramatically. What appeared frozen and motionless becomes active, dynamic, alive. The season is brief, but important. Construction projects accelerate. Supplies arrive. Repairs are completed. People prepare for the next winter. Because preparation never truly ends. The Arctic operates according to cycles. Every season influences the next. Every decision affects future survival. Residents understand this instinctively. They know opportunities are temporary. Windows of favorable weather are limited. Time matters. And nowhere does time feel more precious than in a place where winter dominates so much of the year. Yet even summer cannot erase the Arctic's unpredictability. Because another challenge is emerging. A challenge unlike any previous generation has faced. The Arctic itself is changing, and the people living here are witnessing it firsthand. Elders remember different winters, different ice patterns, different migration routes. The Arctic has always changed naturally, but many residents now speak about changes arriving faster than before. Sea ice forms differently. Storm patterns shift. Seasonal expectations become less predictable. Communities accustomed to reading environmental signals must adapt again. Knowledge remains valuable, but conditions continue evolving. For people whose lives are deeply connected to nature, these changes are impossible to ignore. The landscape itself is transforming, and transformation creates uncertainty. What will future winters look like? What will happen to traditional travel routes? How will communities adjust? No one knows every answer. But Arctic residents understand something important. Adaptation has always been part of life here. For thousands of years, survival depended upon responding to change. That reality remains true today, perhaps more than ever. And the villages standing at the edge of the frozen world may once again demonstrate humanity's remarkable ability to endure. Yet before we explore that future, there are deeper stories hidden within this landscape. Stories of exploration, stories of endurance, stories of people who ventured beyond the limits of the known world. And compared to what comes next, everything we have seen so far is only the beginning. Because farther north, beyond familiar routes and established communities, lies a realm where the Arctic reveals its most extreme character. A realm where survival becomes even more difficult, where isolation becomes even greater, and where one village stands closer to the edge of the world than almost anywhere else on Earth. The journey continues, northward, toward deeper ice, toward greater challenges, toward a place that may truly deserve the title. The last village before the Arctic ends. There comes a point in the Arctic where even the idea of a frontier begins to disappear. The forests are gone. The roads are gone. The last familiar landmarks fade into memory. Ahead lies a world shaped almost entirely by ice, wind, and ocean. A world where nature still operates according to rules written long before modern civilization existed. This is where the Arctic reveals its true character, not as a distant region on a map, but as a living force. A force capable of humbling explorers, reshaping landscapes, and testing human endurance in ways few places on Earth can match. For generations, people have looked north and imagined emptiness. But the Arctic is not empty. It never was. It is filled with stories. Stories of survival. Stories of courage. Stories of communities standing at the very edge of what is possible. And as we continue farther north, those stories become even more extraordinary. Because somewhere ahead lies a settlement so isolated that reaching it feels like traveling to another world. A place where darkness lasts for months. Where sea ice becomes a highway. And where survival depends on understanding an environment that never stops changing. The farther we travel, the more impossible life appears. Yet people are still here. And that raises the same question once again. How? From a distance, the settlement looks almost unreal. A small cluster of buildings surrounded by hundreds of kilometers of wilderness. No neighboring towns. No nearby cities. No easy escape. Only a vast landscape stretching toward the horizon in every direction. To many outsiders, isolation feels frightening. But for those who live here, it is simply reality. The Arctic teaches people to redefine distance. A journey of hundreds of kilometers may be considered normal. A delayed supply shipment may be expected. A week-long storm may be accepted as part of life. What seems extraordinary elsewhere becomes routine here. Yet routine does not mean easy. Every delivery matters. Every resource matters. Every decision matters. Because mistakes are magnified in remote environments. If equipment breaks, replacement parts may be far away. If weather changes, travel plans may collapse instantly. If supplies run low, there may be no quick solution. The margin for error becomes smaller. The importance of preparation becomes greater. And nowhere is preparation more essential than during the Arctic winter. Because winter here is not simply a season. It is an event, a force, a transformation that changes everything. The final sunset arrives quietly. There is no dramatic announcement, no obvious signal. The sun slowly sinks below the horizon. Then it stays there. Days pass. Weeks pass. The darkness deepens. The Arctic enters one of its most mysterious phases, the long polar night. For outsiders, the concept remains difficult to comprehend. Humans evolved around cycles of sunlight. Morning and evening shape our perception of time. But here, those signals disappear. The body must adjust. The mind must adapt. Communities must find ways to thrive without the rhythm most people take for granted. Artificial light becomes essential. Routine becomes important. Social connection becomes critical. Because prolonged darkness affects more than visibility. It affects psychology, emotion, energy, even perception itself. And yet Arctic communities continue functioning. Schools remain open. Work continues. Families gather. Life moves forward. Generation after generation proving something remarkable. Human beings are far more adaptable than they appear. Even when the sun vanishes. Even when the landscape becomes a world of shadows. Even when winter seems endless. Still, darkness is only one challenge. The ocean presents another. Far beyond the village, hunters move across sea ice. The landscape appears frozen, stable, permanent. But appearances can be deceptive. The ice is constantly changing. Pressure builds beneath the surface. Cracks form unexpectedly. Entire sections drift with currents. What looks solid today may become dangerous tomorrow. Travelers must read the environment continuously. A subtle change in snow texture. An unusual sound beneath the ice. A distant ridge formed by pressure. These details provide information, warnings, opportunities, knowledge passed through generations, transforms uncertainty into survival. For thousands of years, Arctic people learned to interpret signals invisible to outsiders. Their understanding became one of humanity's greatest examples of environmental adaptation. Because survival here requires more than strength. It requires awareness, patience, observation. The Arctic rewards those who pay attention and punishes those who do not. That lesson has remained unchanged for centuries. Yet even the most experienced travelers face dangers impossible to predict completely. One of those dangers arrives from the sky. At first, the clouds seem ordinary. A slight darkening along the horizon. Nothing unusual. Then the wind begins to strengthen. Snow lifts from the surface. Visibility decreases. The Arctic transforms. Storms here can develop with startling speed. What begins as a calm day can become a survival situation within hours. Wind-driven snow erases landmarks. The horizon disappears. Direction becomes difficult to determine. Even experienced travelers may struggle. For centuries, storms trapped hunting parties, delayed journeys, forced difficult decisions. Some travelers returned safely. Others never did. The Arctic keeps many stories hidden beneath its snow and ice. Stories of courage. Stories of loss. Stories that remind every generation of the same truth. Nature always has the final word. And nowhere is that truth more evident than in the history of Arctic exploration. For hundreds of years, explorers dreamed of conquering the Arctic. Maps showed empty spaces. Mysteries waited beyond the horizon. The unknown called to adventurers from across the world. Some hoped to discover new trade routes. Others sought fame. Some simply wanted to know what lay beyond the ice. Many never returned. Ships became trapped. Crews disappeared. Entire expeditions vanished into the frozen wilderness. The Arctic earned a reputation as one of the most unforgiving regions on Earth. And yet the fascination never faded. Again and again, explorers ventured north. Again and again, the Arctic challenged them. The irony is striking. While outsiders struggled to survive, indigenous Arctic communities had already mastered life in these environments. Knowledge accumulated over countless generations provided answers that explorers often lacked. The land was difficult, but it was not impossible. The difference was understanding. And understanding remains the most valuable resource in the Arctic even today. Because no technology can replace experience completely. No machine can substitute for wisdom earned across generations. That wisdom continues shaping survival in modern Arctic communities, especially when wildlife enters the story. The bear appears without warning, a distant shape moving across the snow. Powerful, silent, focused. In the Arctic, encounters like this command immediate attention. Polar bears are among the most successful predators on Earth, perfectly adapted to life in the frozen north. Their world overlaps with human settlements, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. Residents learn to remain vigilant. Lookouts monitor surroundings. Safety measures become routine. Respect becomes essential. Because survival here involves sharing space with wildlife that evolved for these conditions. The Arctic belongs to many species. Humans are only one part of a larger ecosystem. Perhaps that reality explains why life here feels different. Nature remains present, visible, powerful. There is no illusion of complete control, only coexistence. And coexistence requires constant awareness, especially during the long months when food becomes scarce and conditions become more difficult for every living thing. Yet even polar bears are not the Arctic's greatest challenge. The greatest challenge may be something far less visible: loneliness. Imagine standing at a window. Outside is darkness. The wind moves snow across frozen ground. The nearest city may be hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. Travel is limited. The environment restricts movement. For many Arctic residents, isolation becomes a familiar companion. Community helps. Family helps. Technology helps. But geography remains powerful. The Arctic creates physical separation unlike almost anywhere else. And that separation influences daily life. Some people embrace it. Others struggle with it. Yet generation after generation continues adapting, finding meaning, finding connection, finding purpose, because humans possess a remarkable ability to create community even in the most remote environments. Perhaps that ability explains why villages continue surviving here. Not because conditions are easy, but because people continue supporting one another despite them. And nowhere is that resilience more visible than during emergencies. When trouble arrives in the Arctic, response often depends on neighbors. A mechanical failure, a sudden storm, an unexpected injury. Challenges can emerge quickly. Distance complicates everything. Weather complicates everything. Yet communities respond. People help. Equipment is shared. Knowledge is shared. Support is shared. This culture of cooperation developed out of necessity. Survival demanded it. And even in the modern era, those traditions remain important. Because the Arctic continues reminding residents that no one thrives entirely alone. Every successful community depends upon trust, mutual assistance, collective resilience. These values become part of daily life, part of local identity, part of what allows villages to endure. But enduring is becoming more complicated, because another force is reshaping the Arctic, one visible from space itself. The Arctic is changing. Ice patterns shift. Coastlines evolve. Seasonal expectations become less predictable. Residents notice differences. Hunters notice differences. Scientists notice differences. The environment remains Arctic. Still powerful. Still dangerous. Still beautiful. But change is occurring. And communities must adapt once again. Adaptation is nothing new here. For thousands of years, Arctic people responded to environmental challenges. The difference today is speed. Change appears faster, more complex, more uncertain. Questions emerge. What will future winters look like? What will happen to traditional travel routes? How will younger generations experience the Arctic? The answers remain unclear. Yet history suggests something important. The people living here have always adapted. And if any communities understand resilience, it may be those standing at the edge of the frozen world. Still, the farther north we travel, the more extreme conditions become. And there are places ahead where adaptation reaches astonishing levels. Places where even seasoned Arctic residents feel the power of the environment. Places where the boundary between civilization and wilderness becomes almost invisible. Some settlements exist so far north that they seem almost impossible. Tiny islands of humanity surrounded by ice, ocean, and darkness. The logistics alone appear overwhelming. Every building, every shipment, every gallon of fuel, every piece of equipment, everything must arrive somehow. And yet life continues. Children grow up. Families celebrate milestones. Communities persist. These settlements represent one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. Not because they conquered nature, but because they learned how to exist within it. The farther north we look, the clearer that lesson becomes. The Arctic cannot be dominated. It can only be understood, respected, adapted to. And those who learn that lesson gain something extraordinary. The ability to survive where few others can. The ability to build homes where most people see only obstacles. The ability to create community in places that seem impossible. That may be the greatest story of the Arctic. Not the ice, not the storms, not the darkness, but the people who remain, the people who endure. The people who continue calling this frozen frontier home. Yet even now, we have not reached the most extreme chapter of the journey, because farther north lies a realm where sea ice stretches beyond the horizon, where winter dominates nearly everything, where the environment feels less like Earth and more like another planet. And somewhere within that realm stands a village that may truly represent the final outpost before the Arctic wilderness takes over completely. The journey is not over. The Arctic still has deeper mysteries to reveal. And compared to what lies ahead, everything we have seen so far may only be preparation. There is a place where the world seems to end, not because there is nothing beyond it, but because beyond it lies something so vast, so unforgiving, and so powerful that human presence begins to feel impossible. This is the edge, the final line between settlement and wilderness, the last light before the frozen world takes over completely. Here, civilization does not disappear all at once. It fades gradually. A few buildings become fewer. Roads become memories. Infrastructure becomes fragile, and eventually, humanity becomes a tiny presence surrounded by an ocean of ice. For centuries, people have looked toward these northern horizons and imagined the end of the world. Yet even here, life continues. People still wake each morning. Children still laugh. Families still gather around dinner tables. The ordinary survives inside the extraordinary. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about humanity. No matter how harsh the environment becomes, people find ways to call it home. But nowhere is that achievement more astonishing than here. At the last village before the Arctic ends, the settlement sits beside a frozen coastline. The ocean stretches endlessly toward the pole. During winter, sea ice consumes the horizon. Land and ocean appear to merge into a single frozen landscape. Looking north feels different. There is a sense of emptiness, a sense of scale, a feeling that beyond the visible world lies something almost beyond comprehension. The distances are enormous. The silence is profound. Nature dominates every direction, and yet the village remains. Its lights glow against the darkness. Its buildings stand against the wind. Its people continue their lives. Every structure represents determination. Every home represents adaptation. Every generation represents survival. Because nothing about this environment makes human habitation easy. Everything must be earned. Warmth, food, transportation, security, comfort. Every aspect of life requires effort. Yet people continue choosing to stay, not because they are trapped, but because this place is home. And home has a power stronger than geography. Inside a warm house, the Arctic feels distant. The wind remains outside. The darkness remains outside. The cold remains outside. Within these walls, life unfolds much as it does anywhere else. Parents help children with schoolwork. Meals are prepared. Stories are shared. Televisions glow. Conversations continue late into the evening. The contrast is extraordinary. Only a few meters separate comfort from extreme conditions. Yet this contrast defines Arctic life. Residents become experts at creating warmth within cold, community within isolation, stability within uncertainty. Perhaps that is why outsiders often misunderstand the Arctic. They focus on hardship. Residents focus on life. Because while the environment is difficult, life here is not defined solely by struggle. It is also defined by belonging, identity, tradition, connection. The Arctic is not merely where these people live. It is part of who they are. And that connection becomes even more important as the environment continues changing. The elders remember different winters, different coastlines, different patterns in the ice. The Arctic has always changed, but many residents speak of changes arriving faster than before. Sea ice forms later. Storms behave differently. Travel routes become less predictable. The landscape itself appears to be evolving. For communities that depend on understanding nature, These changes carry profound consequences. Knowledge passed through generations remains valuable, but adaptation must continue. The Arctic has never remained still, and neither have the people who live within it. Throughout history, survival depended on responding to change. That lesson remains as important as ever. The future may look different, but resilience remains the same. And resilience has always been the defining characteristic of life here. Still, there are moments when nature reminds everyone who truly controls this environment. Moments when the Arctic reveals its full power. The storm arrives like a wall. Wind tears across the landscape. Snow fills the air. Visibility disappears completely. The village vanishes into white. Buildings become shadows. Landmarks disappear. Even familiar surroundings become difficult to recognize. These storms are among the most powerful forces residents face. Movement stops. Travel ends. People remain indoors, waiting, listening, watching, because there is little else to do. The Arctic decides when the storm will end. The Arctic decides when life can resume. Hours pass, sometimes days, yet eventually the wind weakens. The snow settles. The village reappears. And once again, people step outside. Once again, life continues. That cycle has repeated for generations. Storm after storm, winter after winter, decade after decade. The Arctic tests human determination constantly. And somehow, humanity continues passing the test. The morning after a blizzard often feels surreal. The world appears transformed. Snowdrifts reshape the landscape. Paths disappear. New obstacles emerge. Residents begin clearing routes, checking equipment, helping neighbors, returning to routine. It is a reminder that survival here is not a single achievement. It is a daily process, a continuous effort. There is no final victory over the Arctic. Only adaptation, only preparation, only persistence. Perhaps that is why these communities inspire such fascination. They reveal a version of humanity rarely seen elsewhere. A version built upon patience, discipline, cooperation, and respect for forces larger than ourselves. These qualities allow villages to endure where logic suggests they should not exist. But even now, farther north lies an environment where survival becomes even more difficult. A realm where permanent settlements become rare, and where the Arctic begins resembling another planet entirely. The farther north one travels, the more unfamiliar the world becomes. The landscape simplifies. Ice dominates everything. The horizon stretches endlessly. There are few landmarks, few signs of life, only frozen surfaces extending toward the pole. This is the realm that challenged explorers for centuries, the realm that inspired legends, the realm that swallowed expeditions. Even today, it commands respect, because despite technological advances, the Arctic remains unpredictable. Nature retains its authority, and perhaps that is why the region continues captivating the human imagination. There are few places left on Earth where wilderness feels this absolute. Few places where humanity still appears so small. Standing here, surrounded by endless ice, one begins to understand why the Arctic occupies such a powerful place in our collective imagination. It represents possibility, mystery, challenge, and above all, endurance. Yet even in this extreme environment, signs of human resilience remain visible. Because resilience is perhaps our most remarkable trait. The future of these villages rests with younger generations. Children growing up beneath northern skies. Children learning traditions while embracing modern technology. Children inheriting one of the most unique lifestyles on Earth. Their future remains uncertain. The Arctic is changing. Economic pressures exist. Population shifts occur. Opportunities elsewhere can be tempting. Some young people leave. Others stay. Each generation must decide what role the Arctic will play in their lives. Yet many remain deeply connected to these places, connected to family, connected to culture, connected to landscapes unlike any other on Earth. And as long as those connections endure, the villages endure as well. Because settlements are more than buildings, more than roads, more than infrastructure. They are communities. And communities survive through people, through relationships, through shared purpose. That truth remains universal. Whether in a crowded city or a remote Arctic village, human connection is what sustains us, even at the edge of the world. Eventually, every Arctic day ends beneath extraordinary skies. The light softens. Snow reflects gold and orange across the horizon. Silence settles over the landscape. The environment appears peaceful, almost gentle. Yet beneath that beauty remains the same reality that has always defined the Arctic. This is one of the harshest places on Earth. A place where survival requires constant adaptation. A place where nature remains powerful. A place where every generation must earn its place. And yet people continue living here, year after year, century after century, refusing to surrender to distance, refusing to surrender to cold, refusing to surrender to isolation. Their presence tells a story larger than the Arctic itself, a story about humanity, a story about resilience, a story about possibility. Because if people can build lives here, what does that say about our species? What does it reveal about our ability to adapt, to endure, to overcome? Perhaps the answer lies in the villages themselves. Small points of light surrounded by enormous darkness. Tiny communities standing against overwhelming odds. Proof that human determination often extends farther than anyone expects. As darkness returns, the sky begins to move. Green ribbons of light ripple across the heavens. The northern lights dance above the village. The same lights witnessed by countless generations before. The same lights that inspired stories, traditions, and wonder. For a moment, everything becomes still. The Arctic reveals one final reminder of its beauty. A reminder that even the harshest environments contain extraordinary moments. Moments worth protecting. Moments worth remembering. Moments worth calling home. And beneath those lights stands the village. Still enduring. Still adapting. Still alive. A small human presence beneath an infinite sky. A final outpost before the frozen world stretches toward the pole. A place that should not exist, yet does. A place that challenges assumptions about what is possible. A place that proves humanity's greatest strength is not domination. It is adaptation. As we leave the Arctic behind, the village becomes smaller. The coastline fades into the distance. The ice expands beneath us. Soon, the settlement disappears entirely, consumed by the scale of the landscape surrounding it. Yet its story remains. Because this story was never only about the Arctic. It was never only about ice, storms, darkness, or distance. It was about people. People who chose to remain where others could not imagine staying. People who built homes where nature offered few advantages. People who transformed impossibility into routine. Throughout this journey, we crossed frozen oceans, endured polar nights, witnessed storms, followed hunters across moving sea ice, traveled through some of the most remote communities on Earth. And every step revealed the same lesson. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. We survive deserts. We survive mountains. We survive jungles. We survive islands lost in vast oceans. And here, at the top of the world, we survive the Arctic. Not because it is easy, not because it is safe, but because adaptation is woven into who we are. Civilizations rise and fall. Technologies change. Climate changes. Landscapes change. Yet humanity continues finding ways forward. Perhaps that is our defining characteristic. Not strength. Not intelligence. Not technology. Adaptation. the ability to face impossible conditions and create a life within them, the ability to transform wilderness into home, the ability to endure. And nowhere is that ability more visible than in the last village before the Arctic ends. A place standing between civilization and wilderness. A place balanced between survival and uncertainty. A place reminding us that the limits of human possibility may be far greater than we imagine. Because at the edge of the frozen world, where darkness can last for months and ice stretches beyond the horizon, life continues. Against the odds, against expectations, against logic itself. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. No matter how extreme the environment becomes, humanity always finds a way to call it home.